And hello, everyone. Joining me now, Chris Douglas from University of Michigan. Flint, good to see you again. I know it's been a while.
Yeah, always good to see you too, Dave.
The question I want to ask you, because I've talked to a lot of people, and you hear on the network news and from the Biden administration, and the numbers are good. They're improving with the economy. The numbers say that we're supposed to be in a good place. But you talk to, the average person. You walk downtown Flint, you walk in Saginaw, that they're not. So what's the issue? Is it the fact that maybe is mid-Michigan not in a good place, or is it very subjective? What are we seeing here, and what do the numbers say? Are the numbers correct? Are we in a positive place?
So the numbers do suggest we're at a positive place in the sense that unemployment's below 4%, GDP growth, production of vital goods and services, which is what people mean by economic growth, that was over 5% in the third quarter of this year, which is an astronomically high number. Inflation is trending down. It's close to 3% right now, which is close to the Federal Reserve's 2% target. So the numbers suggest that we are in the so-called soft landing, which means getting back to normal without a big recession. But you're right, the vibes, if you want to put it that way, suggest exactly the opposite. And it's not unique to mid-Michigan. So the University of Michigan every month calculates what's called the Index of Consumer Sentiment, where they survey a random sample of households to just ask them about their feelings of the economy. How do you feel in terms of your job security, your ability to earn income, economic outlook, and so forth? And that number is very low. It's at a number that's about the same as what it was in August of 2009, which was the worst part of the Great Recession, where unemployment's nearly 10% and the future is looking very uncertain. So we have this bifurcated economy where the numbers suggest one thing, but consumer sentiment suggests that, well, consumers are about as optimistic as they were during the worst part of the Great Recession.
Wow. Now, I know a lot of people say, and I see it myself, so do you probably, grocery store prices are still up. Is that some of the mental reasoning why someone goes and see, the grocery bill is up? And has it come down? Will it come down? And is that one of the maybe the mental reasons that go into people thinking like, oh, my groceries are still way up?
I think so. So, unfortunately, as far as I could tell, no one asks consumers, well, why exactly are you
Yeah.
pessimistic? It would be great if, like the University of Michigan, where they calculated their index of consumer sentiment, asked consumers, why do you feel this way? But as far as I could tell, they don't. But the Gallup organization that does political polling does a monthly poll that asks a random sample of people, what is the most important problem in the United States? So 30% of people say an economic problem, 70% of people say a non-economic problem, which suggests that maybe most people aren't really worried about the economy. Although the most pressing economic problem cited by people is inflation, which I think makes sense because sure, inflation is coming back down to 3 or 2%, but inflation just means the rise in prices. So when you have 3% inflation, all that means is prices are rising by, say, 3% rather than 8% like they were in 2022. So prices are still going up, just not as fast. So your question was, will grocery prices come down? The answer is no. Prices will never get back down to where they were February of 2020 before the pandemic. So any purchasing power that people lost over the last 3 years is just gone forever.
Wow.
And inflation is one of those problems, maybe the only problem, really, economically speaking, that impacts absolutely everyone. So you think back to the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, unemployment hits 10%, which is very tragic.
Yeah.
But the other side of that coin is 90% of people kept their job. So it was probably stressful with all the economic uncertainty, but if you're one of the 90% of people who were unemployed, life kind of went on as normal. But when you have 8%, 10% inflation like we had in 21, 22, absolutely everyone pays those higher prices. There's no way to be insulated from that because everyone buys groceries, everyone buys consumer goods, everyone buys gasoline, everyone buys cars. Even if you're a big saver, the interest rate being paid on your savings isn't keeping up with the rate of inflation, which sees the value of your savings get whittled out over time.
Yeah.
And I think people are realizing that, well, prices are just never going to come back down to where they were during the pandemic. We're just out all that purchasing power we've lost over the last 3 years.
Wow. So I had someone ask me the other day, I was at a 7-Eleven, someone just stopped me and they recognized me and they said, well, with inflation coming down, then does that mean your steak, your chicken, and the items will start all coming back down to the way they were? And you're saying that's probably not going to be the case.
Not on average. So there are some items whose prices rose by more than the rate of inflation, because prices change for two reasons: changes in supply and demand. If there's like a supply chain issues, for instance,
Yeah.
that could cause prices to rise. That's not what we mean by inflation. That's just a supply and demand issue. So when that supply chain issue gets rectified, prices will come back down. If you think about things like cars, if used car prices rose by faster than the rate of inflation, in large part due to supply chain issues that disrupted the new car market. So people were buying used cars instead and were slow to turn in like their leases, which constrained the supply of used cars. So supply demand issues, once those get fixed, that can cause prices to fall. But if you're talking about prices in general across everything we consume, yeah, they're never coming back down.
What is your, and I hear this a lot online and people shout it out there. It's not inflation. It's corporate greed. That's a lot of people just throw out there who may not, they're not economists and they don't know much about economics, most likely. Maybe some do, but you hear that. You probably hear that from people, maybe students at times. They say, well, what about that? What's your answer to those people who say that?
Well, I assume that corporations were greedy in 2019 when we didn't have inflation. So
Yeah.
if you want to blame corporate greed for inflation, you have to find some compelling evidence that suggests that corporations are more greedy in 2022 compared to 2019.
Yeah. And inflation is caused by what? What would be the answer? Inflation is caused by.
A big increase in the money supply that outpaces the production of goods and services. And that's exactly what happened during the pandemic. The Federal Reserve they did double the money supply during the pandemic from 3.5 trillion to 7.5 trillion dollars. So more than doubling. So where did all that newly printed money go? Well, it went to fund all that COVID stimulus, the 3 rounds of checks, enhanced unemployment benefits, enhanced child tax credits, the $250 billion to state and local governments. So there's lots of other aid on top of that. Well, where did the federal government get the money to make those payments? You're talking $5 trillion worth of COVID aid. Taxes weren't increased. Sure, the government borrowed a lot, but the reason why the government was able to borrow so cheaply was because the Federal Reserve just flooded the zone, if you will, with all this newly printed money. So that's just the classic recipe for inflation. All this newly printed money hits the economy. People try to spend it. That causes prices to rise. So
Yeah, I remember when I was at the TV station, you said the same. You said that you knew that would happen, and that's exactly what happened.
yeah, I mean, it's a real shock to me that so many economists were surprised that there's inflation, since production of goods and services was curtailed during the pandemic due to the various shutdowns. So, if anything, you should have really expected inflation when the federal government is spending all this newly printed money. The production of goods and services is curtailed.
Last question before I let you go, and I appreciate it. Where do we, since we're near the end of the year, are there any predictions? I think the Federal Reserve met recently. Do we have any idea where we may go in 2024? It just seems strange because I don't know where we're going to go next week on certain things.
Right. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, which I think also fuels the lack of consumer optimism. There's always this worry that, well, interest rates remain elevated. I think that's one reason why people are pessimistic, is because housing prices are the most unaffordable they've ever been. You have housing prices that are still at their COVID highs, coupled with mortgage rates being over 7%, which adds hundreds or thousands of dollars to the monthly payment. So if owning the house is the American dream, lots of people are fighting that American dream out of reach, and rent is elevated too. And that's the biggest expenditure of people's budgets. So I'm worried about 2024 in the sense of, you kind of worry that something's going to break, in the sense of you have an economy that's really built on low interest rates over the last 20 years, facing a couple of years now with high interest rates. How long could that go on for? Maybe a long time. It's hard to know. Plus all the geopolitical events that are happening just one after the other. The most recent thing being the Suez Canal is facing a shutdown of shipping due to rocket attacks from Yemen with the Israel-Palestinian war, which is causing shipping companies to have to ship around the tip of Africa, which adds 40% or so to shipping costs. If the Suez Canal just totally shuts down, that could result in a big spike in the price of oil, which traditionally causes a recession. So there's just lots of uncertainty in terms of just the rocky geopolitical events that have been going on really since 2022 with the Russian-Ukrainian war. So who knows what 2024 is going to bring, because geopolitical events, like we saw in the 1970s with the oil shocks, can cause a recession.
And people do not like uncertainty. I think we talked about this before with jobs, and uncertainty is not it doesn't make you feel well about anything in life.
Right. The stock market certainly does not like uncertainty either.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I appreciate you having you on, because I hear a lot of things from people, but I trust you. You're great at what you do. And yeah, I appreciate you taking the time.
Always great to talk with you, Dave. So have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.